So on behalf of everyone here at the Center for Brain Health, welcome to our Frontiers lecture, where we go a deep dive into the newest things that are happening in brain research. A big welcome to everyone who's online today. We really appreciate your time, everyone who's here, and a very special welcome to those who've come for the first time on that. I think we're going to have a very exciting next hour. My name is Andrew Nevin. I'm obviously part of the Center for Brain Health. I have what I think of as the smallest role at the Center for Brain Health. I'm the economist, so 99% of what we do is neuroscience, and you think it would be enough in the world to be able to say that helping people perform better with their brains, to thrive better, to flourish better, as we'll find out today, is good enough in itself. Unfortunately, we're still moved a little bit by economic metrics, so we have to translate all of those good things into economics, and that's my role. But I am very privileged to have friends that think about more important things. We'll be hearing from Matt in a few minutes on that. We're going to have a little time for questions at the end. I'll make Matt stop at 12:45. For those of us who are online today, please type your questions in the chat box. I'll make sure I'm looking at the ones that come online and give them, I don't want to say priority, but everyone has to be treated equally with the people that are here. So that's fantastic. So as we said, we've got Professor Matthew Lee, who is one of the world's leading experts. We all like rankings. I don't know, top 5, top 3, top 10, top 1, somewhere in that range of that on the concept of flourishing on that. And he has a distinguished biography that it's too long to read. But one thing I want to say about Matt that really is important for us is, in the same way that we are focused on translating what we learn about neuroscience into better lives for our different populations, our warriors, corporations, middle school students, neurodivergent young people, Matthew is a leader in the flourishing community in translating the flourishing research into impact in the community. So one of the things he did at Harvard was start the flourishing communities of interest, and this is a major thing that's got 500 people involved around the world in the last few years. So he's just as interested in research or in impact as in research on that. Before I let Matt speak, though, let me just connect brain health to flourishing and why it's so important. So at the Center for Brain Health, we're thinking all the time about brain health and brain performance. But a question you might want to ask yourself, of course, is why do we care about brain health and brain performance? Well, presumably we care because it makes people's lives better. If it didn't make people's lives better, we don't need the Center for Brain Health on that. And we know it makes people's lives better, but what does it mean to have a better life? We often use the word thrive, but there's a whole global community that use the word flourish. Whether it's thriving or flourishing, and Professor Matt will distinguish between those two, it's very important on that. So from our viewpoint, the reason that this lecture is so critical is that it's a chance to connect the brain health community with the flourishing community. And the way I've always thought about it for the last few years is if flourishing is the objective, and I strongly believe that is the objective of human activity, is flourishing for all, brain health is the means. And for that reason, we need a tight cooperation between the brain health community and the flourishing community. And I hope this terrific present by Matt at the Center for Brain Health will be a big start on that. So no more word. I'm not going to tell any more about Matt's biography, other than to say, like me, he's new to Texas. He came from Harvard. He came 2 years ago. We now have the Flourishing Armada. We have Matt in Waco. We have a really senior guy down at UT Austin. We have someone else at Texas Tech. So we'd really like Texas to be the flourishing home of the world. Professor Matthew Lee.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that kind introduction, and I hope I get an extra minute for the mic transfer here. I'm really delighted to share a little bit about, this is a weekend seminar at minimum, but we'll try to do what we can about why brain health is important for the global conversation about human flourishing. We need to know a little bit about flourishing. We need to know a little bit about what the global conversation has been. So our objectives include defining flourishing, and I would say this is a conversation, this is a critical dialogue. There's not one definition of flourishing. So I'll offer what I have sensed from the global field. It seems to be emerging around a shared definition of flourishing, but not everyone agrees. We'll consider flourishing then as a possible North Star for all human activity. Describe some simple measures of flourishing and then explore the importance of brain health for flourishing and invite collaboration. This is really what I'm most interested in. As Andrew said, I care about the research, but I really want to see different bodies of research connected to inform practice and frankly to inform system transformation. So this will include the possibility of incorporating some flourishing measures in research that's already looking at brain health. What are some of the outcomes related to flourishing? And possibly the establishment of an interest group within the Flourishing Network that's hosted by the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. So I've already talked with some folks about doing that, and there's other ways to get involved. I think what's imperative is that we understand that you really don't have brain health without a consideration of flourishing, and you don't have flourishing without consideration of brain health. And yet these are mostly separate topics within the research and also within practice. So this is our opportunity, one opportunity to come together and figure out how to create something more holistically integrated. So I always love to start with this. Some of you might have seen this movie, a fictionalized account of the life of Mr. Rogers, the children's television show host. The film was a little closer, okay. The film was called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And if you've seen this film, you remember the lunch meeting, which is sort of the turning point between this rather disgruntled journalist and Fred Rogers, who's sort of trying to help him grow and flourish. And so the journalist is complaining about all the bad things in the world and all the ways that people have done him wrong. And Fred stops him and says, "Would you take, along with me, 1 minute to think of all the people who have loved you into being? 1 minute, and I will watch the time." So I would like to invite us to pause from our lunch for a moment and take this minute to do this exercise. I've found that this is really a good way to orient us towards the topic of flourishing, not as just an intellectual exercise, but as an embodied experience. So if comfortable for you, you can close your eyes. You don't have to, but sort of take a cleansing breath. And then maybe rather than thinking of all the people who have loved you into being, think of one person who has really helped you to become your best possible self. Someone who has helped you to achieve your potential. Call into your mind's eye an image of this person. It might be a teacher or a parent or friend or mentor. And once you have an image of this person, think about one thing that they've done for you specifically that has really helped love you more fully into being, to become that best person that you might become. And then just notice how you feel about that. What feeling might be evoked when you reflect in this way. Notice if there's any sense of gratitude there. And just in closing, know that if this person could be aware of you reflecting in this way and possibly feeling gratitude, that they would feel happy about that, that would contribute to their flourishing. Okay, so that's a little bit more than a minute, but I think it's worth spending the time to make the point, how do we flourish? We flourish because others have loved us into being. And we flourish because others have given us the opportunity to love them into being. So it's really reciprocal. So flourishing results from relationship. All flourishing is mutual, in the words of one book on the topic. So then we can ask this question. This seems like a paradox, but maybe it's not. Why do materially advantaged factory workers, and we could lump in other groups too, university students, medical and psychiatry residents, and the list goes on, in the U.S. report lower flourishing than materially precarious factory workers in places like China, Mexico, and Cambodia? So these are self-reported flourishing scores that we've published in our previous work. And I'll talk a little bit about the work in the Global Flourishing Study, but we've done some work with specialized populations, including factory workers. If we measure self-reported financial material stability on a 0 to 10 scale, some of these factory workers in the other countries are reporting like 3 out of 10 on average, very low. They feel unsafe, they feel financially precarious, they're right on the edge. And in the United States, it's much, much higher. And yet, we find on all of the other flourishing domains that we've measured, the US scores are quite lagging. So why is that? You would think that quality of life is better, that we're safer, and we're able to then pursue these other domains of flourishing, like meaning and purpose and character and virtue, et cetera, that would give us an advantage. But it doesn't seem to play out that way in the research. And so I always like to show this image of a couple of areas in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where there's a fence dividing the high-rise where people have the private pool on their individual balconies from others who have much less financial material wealth, but maybe they've got something else. And so if we think about flourishing as integrating individual, organizational, communal, planetary, and spiritual dimensions of life-affirming forms of well-being in ways that promote well-doing, which is kind of a long definition, but it's driving at this sense that flourishing really is quite holistic, then we might ask certain kinds of questions that can help us understand why we might not find higher flourishing in the high-rise. So on which side of the fence do we find the highest levels of flourishing? I would ask some follow-up questions like, where are people most alienated from themselves, from others, from nature, and from a sense of the sacred? Or when do people feel fully alive and empowered to care for each other? Or when do they feel like lifeless bodies in a system? And this quote, lifeless bodies in a system, comes from a student at a very well-funded, materially advantaged public high school in Silicon Valley in an article about youthful suicide among affluent, well-resourced students who seemingly have unlimited opportunities before them. And this student said, this kind of insane individualized competition that our lives have become is really making us feel like we're just being used by the system. We're not contributing much, but something's being extracted from us. And that feeling of extraction leads people to feel very unsafe. And interestingly, I'll just check in with my current score. I've got a heart monitor on right now, and it's tracking how interested I am and how safe I feel. Right now, my interest score is 76 out of 100, and my safe score is 4 out of 100. So I'm not terribly comfortable in front of audiences, but I'm very interested in this topic. So, when do we feel safe and interested? When do we feel like we value what we're doing? Or are we being put through some process that doesn't align with our values and we feel like we're being extracted from? And so even if you have all of the financial and material wealth, you might feel like your life is unsafe. You might feel like you're constantly in this mode of servitude where you're serving something that you don't believe in, that benefits others, that others are extracting from you, as opposed to servanthood, which is really your sense of calling. You're serving a noble purpose that you care about, and you're connecting with others in healthy ways to do that. So when I look at the material conditions now, I think it might be that folks on the other side of the fence don't feel like lifeless bodies in the system because they're in this mode of servanthood rather than servitude. So in this cover story in the Harvard Gazette a couple of years ago, they posed the question, are you healthy? Maybe, but are you fully flourishing? And in that article, I talk about the importance of love in the promotion of flourishing. And I say that the difference between mere health, which of course we desire health, but mere health and full flourishing is prioritizing deep, fulfilling, loving relationships. And I would add, in service of a virtuous purpose. George Valiant, former director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which has now followed people for 8 decades, very famously quipped that happiness equals love, full stop. And the current director of that project says that the clearest message we get is from this 75-year study is that good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. So there's something about relationships, and Paul Zak, the person who's designed this app that I'm using right now, argued that it's through our warm interactions with others that we engage the brain in a way where oxytocin and dopamine are more present, and we feel these as key moments in our lives, as peak experiences. And if we're isolated and feel like lifeless bodies in a system, then we're not going to have that kind of experience, and life is going to feel like a constant set of insurmountable challenges. That's a little bit of a paraphrase. I don't know that Paul would necessarily have said it that way, but so what is love? We need some clarity about this. One definition of love that's helpful, at least for interpersonal love, is it's a disposition towards desiring the good of the other. In other words, I want to promote your flourishing and you want to promote my flourishing. We can say we love each other. And something short of that, we might say that there's emotions involved, and psychiatrists call that cathexis, not love. Cathexis can serve love, but cathexis can turn into jealousy. I was a criminologist for the first half of my career. It can turn into murder-suicide. So cathexis by itself can be in service of love, which is in service of flourishing. So we need to have some clarity about what these words mean as we move forward. And then we can do things like my friend Bill. I don't know if the green dot will show it very well. It seems to disappear. Anyway, Bill's wearing the dark suit. These are his medical students, and his medical students are indicated as dots on this chart, where the horizontal axis is burnout and the vertical axis is wellness. And now he's measuring flourishing. And Bill and I have a book chapter coming out titled Love as the Essence of Flourishing. And you can see the red circle with the white star. That's the national average for medical students. And a lot of Bill's students were really suffering in terms of burnout and not very strong on wellness relative to the national average. And one approach is to say, well, my job is to weed out the weak. And so good, some of these students will drop out, they shouldn't become doctors anyway. But that's not Bill's approach. You walk into Bill's class, and the first thing he says to the class is, I love you. And that means I'm committed to your flourishing. And that means it very clearly that when we see this, we have an obligation to act on it. So he created a space in which the students could attend. Well, it went ahead without me. Anyway, you see what happened. So he created what I would call an ecosystem of sacred hospitality that encouraged these students to love each other more fully into being, in the sense that Fred Rogers was talking about it. And then he could measure and celebrate the results. So there's something that happens when people go on a virtuous journey together. Aristotle talked about virtuous friendships. And we have friendships of utility and friendships of pleasure, but we don't often talk about virtuous friendships. But virtuous friendships are when friends want to love each other more fully into being, to promote each other's flourishing. So he created a space where students were doing this for each other, and you see the incredible movement, and it persisted a year later. And this was without any institutional resources or any nudge from the administration. It was just something that he responded to. So when we think about, what's the difference between flourishing and some of these other closely related constructs, I think that flourishing is much more holistic. In this book, The How of Happiness, Sonia Lyubomirsky says that happiness is the experience of joy, contentment, and positive well-being combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. So that's great, but it's all about my perspective as an individual. Similarly, wellness is the act of practicing healthy habits on a daily basis to attain better physical and mental health outcomes, so that instead of just surviving, you're thriving. Again, that's a desired end, and we should work towards that. Well-being could be defined as how people feel and how they function, both on a personal and social level, and how they evaluate their lives as a whole. it's all great, and it's still all from the vantage point of the individual having the subjective experience. So these lemmings here, one says to the neighbor, "I've really improved my subjective sense of well-being recently," and the neighbor says, "Hey, that's great, but where do you think we're going today?" So this is, I think, gives us a sense of what we mean by flourishing. Flourishing includes that collectively we're going somewhere good together. We're not just extracting happiness for ourselves, for our in-group, for our neighborhood, for our state, for our nation, for our society, at the expense of others. So what does it include then? I wrote a couple of years ago, the full meaning of flourishing transcends narrow well-being of the individual. It includes that, but it transcends it to encompass the thriving of the whole. At its broadest, this includes not only all people, but also the entire ecosystem, and for the spiritual and religious, the realm of the sacred. So for some people, feeling good, contributing to a noble purpose, if misaligned with a sacred narrative that gives life an overall coherence, still is not flourishing. So you really want to bring all of these things into dialogue in some way. So I argue that flourishing is the North Star or ultimate aim of all human endeavors. And if you're skeptical about this, read this beautiful book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. I don't remember in any of my math classes anyone ever talking about flourishing. But I think that if you do frame everything that you're doing in terms of this ultimate North Star, mathematics is going to serve flourishing, then it gives people a reason to really pay attention and want to become more excellent at it. And so Francis Su, in this book, I think very helpfully says, human flourishing refers to wholeness, of being and doing, of realizing one's potential and helping others do the same, of acting with honor and treating others with dignity. So flourishing is really virtuous in this sense. It's not just about me, but it's about us. And then I think this is really important, of living with integrity even in challenging circumstances. So it's not that flourishing is over here and suffering is over here. We're moving away from it. We're living with integrity even in the midst of suffering. Because in some cases, the more you love, the more you suffer for the people that you love. So there's no escape necessarily from the pain that other people are feeling, but you don't have to always turn that into suffering. You can think about it more holistically and live in this sense of wholeness amidst adversity. Francis Su says that flourishing comes through the exercise of virtue, and that virtue, very simply defined, is excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. And again, I don't remember any conversations about virtue in my math classes, but I think it would have helped me to pay attention a little bit more. And he says the proper practice of mathematics cultivates virtues that help people flourish, and the final chapter of this book is on love, which seems really strange. Like, I don't remember any conversation about love in my math classes. But it's not strange when you understand love as this disposition to desire the good of the other, in other words, to promote flourishing. And if math can have this aim, why not all human endeavors? Some of our friends at the Kern National Network for Flourishing in Medicine, and they changed the name of their group to include the word flourishing as they journeyed with us in some conversations, have really positioned flourishing as the North Star. And you can see, and that's very faint, but you can see they're talking about individuals, they're talking about medical and other health professions, they're talking about systems, and they're talking about society. So they understand this as multi-level. And I think that's right. And they start with the kind of roots of caring and character leading to practical wisdom. And that's not something that's often taught explicitly in medical education, but they're trying to infuse that on the idea that not only will healthcare professionals become more clinically effective, but they will also flourish themselves, because there's a great crisis within healthcare workers in terms of burnout and other related problems. And so the compassionate thing is to have the appropriate North Star and then have the skills necessary to move in that direction. Earlier this year, I was asked to give a talk on the relationship between artificial intelligence and flourishing. And I said yes because there was some financial and material stability associated with that, even though I'm not an expert at AI at all. So I did what everyone's doing these days, and I just typed it into GPT, and then I took the answer and I asked PowerPoint to create a slide, and PowerPoint found this cute little robot. And so what came back is that flourishing is the key criterion for evaluating the impact of AI. And so I said, how is the concept of flourishing helpful in an age of artificial intelligence? And the answer, in part, was that the concept of flourishing provides a holistic framework for evaluating the impact of AI on individuals and society in guiding the development of AI technologies in ways that contribute to human flourishing and well-being. By prioritizing human values and considering the broader implications of AI, we can harness its potential to create a more inclusive, equitable, and flourishing future for all. Sounded pretty good. So why not flourishing as the criterion by which we judge AI and all other human and transhuman endeavors? And then, you know, when the machine gun carrying robot dogs take over, we'll know exactly how far away we are from promoting flourishing. So anyway, what about suffering? So this is a painting that my youngest son painted when he had a summer of really debilitating migraine headaches. And these were really bad, and it would often leave him incapacitated for 3 days and disrupt a lot of things he wanted to do and disrupt a lot of things that we wanted to do. And so he painted this not really knowing what it represented, and I suggested to him, maybe this purple wave is sort of the next migraine coming, and you can sense it, and you're sort of screaming at it, but there's nothing you can do about it. He said, that's one interpretation, I don't know. But it reminds me of my friend Paul Wong's helpful, you know, researchers love to create these 2x2s, helpful distinction between what he calls flourishing and what we might call, or he calls, the complete positive life. So we aim for the dream life, but sometimes we get debilitating migraines. And so flourishing is the deep life where there might be anxiety and stress and some suffering, but there's also a sense of well-being. And so these things are not always opposed to each other. You can have them at the same time. And so even that summer with that debilitating problem, which thankfully has gotten better, there was a sense that we could flourish even through that, and that some sense our connections to each other as a family could become stronger through the shared suffering, by being present in a loving way to that suffering. And so one of our friends in the Flourishing Network from Japan talks about, well, we don't say flourishing in Japanese. We talk about the flavorful life. We talk about the delicious life. And that, you know, this is one of the trays. She hosts Japanese tea ceremonies. And you take a bitter taste and then a sweet taste, and the combination of those things is rich. It's flavorful. And she said, you know, there's no sense that somehow we're going to flourish and escape all suffering, but there is a sense that our life can be enriched by a skillful working with suffering. And to do that, this is where I'm starting to segue now into brain health in the 15 or so minutes I might have left. This is where we really need to understand how the brain works and how we can reframe. So when I get this number that I'm scoring very low on safety, I can begin to reframe what I'm doing as, oh, this is a room of supportive people who love me more fully into being, and then I can watch that score go up in real time. So for my son Nathan, it was really important for us to stop just reacting to what we couldn't control and try to reframe it differently. And I wouldn't say we were always perfectly successful at that, but if you understand how migraines are triggered and then how they persist, there are some things you can do, just even in terms of reframing, that can be helpful, mitigate the symptoms and reduce the length of time. So one of the things that I've taken from the Center for Brain Health, as I've been very delighted to have connected with Andrew and to be having these conversations, is that brain capital is the new oil boom, that our collective brain power is a prosperity and national security asset. And yet, when we think about all of the work that we've done to promote flourishing, through the Global Flourishing Study, through the development of a global community of practice, the Flourishing Network, which we've talked about, the Flourishing app, some of our books like Transcending Crisis by Attending to Care, Emotion, and Flourishing, brain science is almost entirely absent. So that's why when I received the invitation, I thought, oh, this is a good opportunity to say, well, we can't do it all, but we can invite experts to be in relationship with us so that we can love the construct of flourishing more fully into being. And so I want to share just a little bit about forms that this could take. So I'm also a visiting scholar at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine at UMass Hospital. And they have a program also called SMART. There stands for Stress Management and Resiliency Training. And then 3RP, which is the Relaxation Response Resiliency Program. And earlier this year, I was part of a team that presented some preliminary results from a randomized controlled trial at the Society for Behavioral Medicine. I'll just read one of our findings. That community residents at a senior living center in SMART 3RP showed enhanced resiliency and flourishing as we measure it with our flourishing index at 3 months relative to residents in a waitlist control arm. Results were maintained at 6 months, and findings support that group-based mind-body resiliency training integrated into senior living communities. I think the community part is important because it's through the relationships that this program works. In partnership with community stakeholders, benefits independent living residents. So one easy way to begin to integrate brain science with flourishing is to start using some of the flourishing measures as potential outcomes. And then when I think about my own journey through the Center for Brain Health's SMART program, and you can see unhappily, well, it doesn't show up. But anyway, that's my decline in clarity from baseline to T2. So I've got some work to do, but it was really helpful to go through the coaching and understand that the way I was responding to one of the sections might have depressed my clarity score a little bit because I was imposing a fairly narrow virtue framework on that, which is not normal. People don't usually do that. So I think I messed up the algorithm in a sense. But that's why it's a dialogue, and that's why flourishing is also a dialogue. It's not you get your 10 out of 10 and declare victory. You might not be self-assessing very accurately. So you've got to have conversation partners, and those partners have to love you because they have to know you at a deep level so that they can help you understand when some of your self-appraisals might need work. And so as I've been involved in this, this journey using the Brain Health Index and using the SMART program through the center, it's just really helpful for me to understand, okay, you don't need 10,000 steps, maybe it's 8,000 steps a day that's most beneficial for the brain. So like, what's the latest science about how I can improve my brain health through walking a certain number of steps? And then, you know, I keep coming across these headlines like Steve Jobs swore that the 10-minute rule made him smarter. Modern neuroscience is discovering he is right. So if you're stuck on a problem for 10 minutes, get up and take a walk. And that unleashes some creative thinking. And then you can flourish because you didn't spend the whole day wasting your time and now you're depressed or feeling like a lifeless body in a system. With a little simple, you know, couple of steps, you've been able to transcend that. And so just understanding the brain-body connection is really helpful to flourishing. We've got this study called the Global Flourishing Study, where we're looking at following up for 5 years, once a year, the same 200,000 individuals in nationally representative samples in 22 countries, representing 64% of the world's population. So we can almost generalize to humanity because of them. I say almost. But, you know, this research is really the richest longitudinal data set on human flourishing, but it's got, I would say, very little about brain science. It's got a little bit that's implicitly brain science, but nothing terribly explicit. But there is an opportunity because we know we have geographic indicators for each of the respondents, there might be ways that we could connect to brain science data sets. So we would welcome researchers who might want to partner in that. And, how do we measure flourishing? Well, we don't get all of flourishing. We don't get wholeness within amidst adversity, but we've got these domains as kind of baseline markers for flourishing at the individual level. And again, we can connect because we have the geographic indicators with economic indicators like GDP. We can connect with environmental impact scores. And so there's an attempt now on the part of the Human Flourishing program at Harvard and a group at Oxford University to begin to connect these data sets. So we have macroeconomic, political, and environmental measures connected to the individual's experiences. So this is all very much in progress. We just received the first wave of data earlier this year. We're producing the first set of about 70 journal articles. About 50 of them are currently under review. And we hope that those will be published sometime in March, if things go smoothly, which they never do. We're hoping to have an article in the journal Nature, which is one of the most cited journals, and then a group of articles in the Nature Springer platform sharing the first set of findings. I'm leading a paper on showing love and care around the world, and each of these papers has between 150 and 250 supplemental pages of tables. So it's a lot of information to try to bring together. But one of the things I can say about that paper is that we're showing an inverse relationship between GDP and whether people show love and care to other people. And so it's not surprising, given what I said earlier about the factory workers, but it is food for thought for those of us in richer nations to think about how our flourishing could be enhanced if we prioritize relationships a little bit more. How might we measure individual flourishing if we had only space for 5 items? Because I get this question all the time. All right, your individual measure has 12 items, your community measure has 25, you've got the spiritual measure that has another 20. We don't have room for all of that in our survey. So what can we do if we only have space for a handful of items? And we've got a paper on this, a chapter on this in our book, Measuring Well-Being, which is available for free download, open access download through Oxford University Press. So you can get that chapter, and then you can also get the response to that chapter where some of the participants in our workshop repudiated everything we said about our recommendations, and how could you make such recommendations? And then we responded saying, oh, this is how we could do that, and this is why, is that satisfying? And then the response was, no, that's not satisfying at all. So it's a critical dialogue. But just as a starting point, just as a baseline, if I were working with a group of students or a group of doctors or really anyone in any sector, I would start asking questions. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? And I think that student who felt like a lifeless body in a system would say 0 out of 10. I may have unlimited opportunities, I may be a gifted student, I may have all this support, but I don't feel like it matters. I feel like it's just servitude, not servanthood. And then this one seems, in some of our research, seems very predictive of all of the other domains of flourishing that we measure. To what extent do you act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging ones? Is it not true, or is it completely true, or somewhere in the middle? Depending on how people answer this, we can predict in future waves that they're going to have higher scores on all of the other domains. So there's something about character and virtue that's really central to flourishing. And then relationships are just as central. Are your relationships as satisfying as you would want them to be? And then how often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? Do you worry all the time, or do you never worry? And then for religious and spiritual people, from the spiritual well-being measure, to what extent have you come closer to God or higher power or whatever you understand through prayer and spiritual practices? And for some people, you can have all the others, but if this one is not right, then there's something less than flourishing that's being described. So the argument that I will make, and I don't think it's controversial, and certainly not to folks in this room, is that training our brains very skillfully can help our bodies express loving care And that helps move us beyond this cycle of sacrifice, which has been so well documented among leaders who feel inundated and isolated, among students who become more disengaged with each year they spend K through 12. And most workers around the world are not engaged in what they're doing. Usually in the United States, it's around 30% are engaged. Elsewhere, it's more like 15 to 20%. So most people do feel like lifeless bodies in the system in this constant cycle of sacrifice. So we want to move into the cycle of renewal. And I'm drawing here on Boyatzis and McKee's book, Resonant Leadership, where the kind of entry point here with the arrow is that you start to wake up. You start to become more aware of yourself and surroundings. And I would say more aware of how your brain actually functions. And you want to understand and care for another person to initiate some kind of action contributing to that person's well-being, that person's flourishing. And then you get greater activity in the left prefrontal cortex than the right. You get the release of oxytocin. You get arousal of the parasympathetic, lower blood pressure, better immune functioning. And then you get this feeling of hope, peace, and excitement about the future, and that makes you want to wake up even further and engage in more caring behaviors to love others more fully into being. So you start this cycle of renewal and get out of this cycle of sacrifice. And this works even with predators, like this shark here. This is a still from a video that one of the members of our Flourishing Network shared. He likes to take pictures of sharks. And he said, you know, this, and he showed this video of this shark coming straight at him, and he just sort of gently nudges it with his camera, and it just moves on. And he said, a lot of people see the beginning of this video, and they think this is an aggressive act. And he said, I knew that this was a curious friend, not an enemy. And so, you know, this is really important because he's in this cycle of renewal because he understands the cues. There are times where you want to be away from the sharks, but this shark was very safe. And so the invitation is to join our Flourishing Network and take an intentional journey towards greater flourishing in the company of friends. And what we learn in this journey is that everyone is a potential friend. And so if there's anyone who would like to be involved in starting an interest group or a community of practice that would integrate brain health science with the science of flourishing, we would be delighted to host that and think about, again, how we can start connecting data sets and understanding more holistically the relationship between brain health and human flourishing. So I'll stop. I've got more slides, but I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Stay up here. It's going to be quick. Come on, let's give a bigger round of applause. Give it up for Professor Matthew Lee on that. So we've got a few minutes for Q&A. I'm going to start with, there's an interesting online question, which I'm going to paraphrase slightly. And you may not, we may actually get someone else in the audience to supplement the answer, but Matt, what's going on?
I was just checking my safety score.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
It's holding steady at a very solid 3 out of 100. So maybe the question and answer period is
all right, let's give him a little bit more love, so that's cool. Thumbs up on that. Big hand for... So a question online, which I'm going to paraphrase slightly, is what is going on in the brain that's different between short-term pleasure and flourishing? I mean, because I think we would say flourishing has to have some physical manifestation of what's happening in the brain. From where you sit as the world's leading expert in flourishing, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, when you call me the world's leading expert, my safety goes back into the basement. I think, you know, what I would say is that we are involved in a global conversation about flourishing, and I'm able to name some convergent thinking that's emerging. But we know that a lot of apps, like social media apps, are designed to prey upon short-term feelings of pleasure or short-term anxieties. And so this is why a number of states are suing a number of the owners of these platforms, because it's really a manipulation of something that's easy and quick that you can manipulate. So the Human Flourishing Program was founded in 2016 on the premise that we want to integrate the deep wisdom of the humanities with rigorous social science methodologies. And so what the wisdom of the humanities would say about that question, by way of answer, is to say that it's a different process to cultivate a long-term sense of gratification with your contribution to the greater good. And there's probably in some ways different neural mechanisms involved in that, so that what's happening with these short-term manipulations is that we're short-circuiting the cultivation of that slower process of coming to a deep gratification from contributing to the greater good. And for a lot of people, in terms of a sacred narrative, something that manifests something that's holy or set apart from the profane. So I think that these short-term mechanisms can be in service of that long-term goal, or they can short-circuit that long-term goal. So I think it's really helpful for us to begin to connect what we can learn, and you all are the experts about brain science, so I don't want to speak outside of my expertise, but what can we learn about what's going on in the brain relative to the deep wisdom that we get from humanities traditions, which counsels kind of the long view rather than next quarter's profits or something. So our systems are often set up to get us focused on, this is the thinking fast and slow and all the other stuff that you probably
understood.
Get.
Okay, so one last comment from online. We've already got someone who wants to be part of the interest group, so we'll make sure everyone gets connected on that. Let me open it up for a question from the live audience right here in the front. Do we have a microphone, or do we?
We've got a question here.
No, you.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you so much for your excellent talk. I have two questions. So one is that although, of course, the goal is to promote well-being for all people, are there certain prerequisites needed to flourish? Can I flourish in a black hole, or do I need a certain level of social cognitive abilities, for example, or freedoms? And my other question is, what activities have been shown to promote flourishing? Instead of waiting to feel loved, are there things that I can do on my own to flourish?
I'll take the second one first. We did a little gratitude exercise, which I've seen in some of the materials for the center is one of the recommendations. So there's a lot of work within positive psychology that has shown some practices can move the needle on some domains of flourishing. So gratitude can boost our sense of happiness, for example. Your question about, is it possible to flourish, let's say in a prison cell where you're in solitary confinement. I think flourishing is always a journey, not a destination, and it's always relative to baseline. So what's our baseline? And there's a project one of my colleagues at Baylor is leading on flourishing in a maximum security prison, including death row. And when he visits death row in this prison, he says, I'm amazed at how the men on death row are ministering to me. I'm amazed at the sort of spiritual wisdom that they have. And so I think that certainly there are environments that can be quite conducive to helping us flourish more together, but sometimes really harsh places can help us wake up as well. And so one of our friends in the Flourishing Network did her dissertation on young people with fourth stage cancer diagnoses. And some of them lived and some of them died, but many of them, whether they lived or died, they woke up to the importance of relationships, and they weren't talking about how they compare with others on Facebook. You know, they were sort of immersed in a context that was inviting them to connect with what really matters in life. And so, it seems like a paradox, but it's not really a paradox. You see this with natural disasters sometimes. People have said that natural disasters, despite all the suffering and loss of life and deprivation, sometimes release human beings from the social disaster of everyday life, where they feel like a lifeless body in a system. Because now you need me and I need you, and we've got a shared purpose. And before, I'm just a cog in the machine. So it seems like a paradox, but really what is it that we need? We need to give and receive love in meaningful ways. We need to see our love make a difference in the world. And some structures can invite that, and some structures can get in the way of that. Yeah.
Okay, now it's on. You mentioned at the beginning of your comments, by the way, thank you for coming. It was very interesting. When you mentioned in the beginning about Americans lagging behind so many other countries in the world. And the question I have also has to do with the other question, which are we not raising children in a way that makes them resilient? Are we not cultivating this idea of communitarianism? What is it that is making Americans lag so far behind so many other countries when we are, in a sense, the richest country, the somewhat educated country compared to others? But is there something, because I see children, I have grandchildren, the level of resilience doesn't exist, and it seems that there is this value, they are trained to value financial success over everything else, and they don't seem to have this purposeful life.
So I have to be very careful. Otherwise, the headline will be, Harvard flourishing researcher hates America. That's not the headline. Yeah. No, but I think, there have been surveys that have shown among college students that some decades ago there was more of an aspiration towards meaning and purpose. I'm here at college to find my deeper sense of meaning and purpose and contribute to the world. And then more recently, the surveys are surfacing, I'm here to get a lucrative job. And when you do that, you're moving into servitude without knowing it. You've lost your sense of calling, and now it's a means to an end. And this is a daily struggle. Anyone who's got teenagers or early age college students are struggling with this right now, because you try to say that's not the path to flourishing, that's a path to material stability, but that's a means to an end. So in the Harvard Human Flourishing Programs framework, there are 5 individual domains that are ends in themselves. And financial material stability is an enabling domain. It's a means to an end. But if you make that, this is the question of love again. Our loves are not always rightly ordered. If we love the wrong things at the wrong level, if we love that as an end, then we're in for some existential crisis in the near term. So I do think that there could be a helpful cultural reframing of the purpose of education. It's not to get a credential, to get a lucrative job. It's to become a human being. And education broadly conceived. Yeah.
Question over here, Matt.
Thank you for your comments. I just retired, and I decided to work with people in recovery from addiction. And so as I'm thinking through this, I'm saying, okay, what does it look like to be a recovered addict? And what does it look like to be a flourishing person in recovery from addiction? So what are some insights you'd have for me?
Well, this is another complicated topic. I would say we had a 4-year grant to study young people who were, among other things, they were in therapy and doing a variety of things. They were working the 12 steps in order to maintain daily sobriety. Many of them were using various substances, alcohol, drugs, also engaged in various forms of delinquency, including violent forms. And so, what seems to be really imperative there is either a connection or reconnection with what we called twin virtue, which is basically receiving love and giving love. And so, but you need help practicing that. So we did a paper on the fact that many of these young people were experiencing clinical levels of social anxiety. So how can they give love to others if they're nervous about being around others? And so one of the things that the 12 12-step groups do well is they invite people to grow gently into serving others. So don't talk to other people if you're nervous about that, but help us put the chairs away at the end of the meeting. Help us make coffee at the beginning of the meeting. So you're getting like a little bit, you're not overwhelming your muscles, but you're sort of exercising the muscles and strengthening those things. And so what one of our colleagues found is, the 12th step is really about loving others more fully into being. And if you only do 11 steps, you don't quite get the full benefit. So those who do the 12th step are 40% more likely to maintain sobriety. So one of the articles that we wrote about this, we said the old biblical adage that it's better to give than receive. A lot of times people are understood to be a bundle of needs, and we have to create programs that meet their needs. Really what the biggest need is, they need to see their love make a difference. So they need to begin to meet the needs of others and to invite others to do the same thing. And I think that's what the 12-step programs do relatively well. 12 steps are not a replacement for therapy or other treatment modalities. It's an adjunct, and it only works if you work the steps. So when you see studies that find it only worked for 5%, well, what was the dose? How many of them got to the 12th step through the process of taking moral inventory and sort of admitting a right ordering of self and all the rest? So, I would say that it's always relative to baseline. So what's your flourishing measure when you started this journey, and where are you now? And sometimes, this is a little bit, I guess, maybe controversial and might overcomplicate things, but if people discover that they were narcissistic and inflating their scores, then a lower score is actually a sign of flourishing. And, we've had, for example, Bill, who I mentioned earlier, he used the flourishing measure with some first-year medical students, and then did a focus group with them. And he said, wow, your scores are really low. And finally someone said, well, they're even lower than what I put on the form, because I wanted to, well, why would you lie to yourself? This is not for any external consumption. This was for your benefit. Well, if I tell the truth to myself, then I'm going to really fall off the cliff. I'm really struggling, but I got to pretend I'm a 5 out of 10 in order to get out of bed in the morning. So if I really admit that I'm 2 out of 10, where does that leave me? And his response would be, it leaves you with the truth that you can now work with.
Okay, Matt.
So flourishing, oh, sorry, we're probably running
last
out of
question
time.
I'm going to give over to my brother, who I love, Stephen White.
Thank you.
Quick
for
question.
that question.
I love you too, Andrew. Matt, it's good to see you again.
Yes.
It's interesting to me because when I think about it, and it's a carry on from her question, it seemed, and I have young kids, so I know they're all in their 20s. I think they're flourishing. But I think they were taught early on, they received high school education in California, and there was this idealism that came out that said, if you're not doing something that you're passionate about and is helping the world when you work, you're failing. And so I think we have a generation of kids who, when they can't find nirvana, they're disappointed in themselves, and they probably score low on these flourishing scores. Capitalism's okay. Flourishing is not capitalism or the lack thereof. How do you talk to the younger generation so they don't confuse these concepts?
Yeah, there's a great article on workism, which is basically trying to invest work with a level of meaning that it can't provide. So if you have a sense of deeper purpose to your life, your work can be in support of that purpose. But if all of your eggs are in the work basket, especially when you're starting out, you get some kind of entry-level position, you're going to find a disparity between your expectation, which is totally unreasonable, and what can be offered by the current job structure. So there's a few things that can be done there. One is to rightly order your love of work relative to your love of other aspects of the human experience. And the other is to say, okay, I'm in this job, it's not quite what I wanted, but what am I doing it for? Do I have a meaningful purpose that I need to be disciplined enough to stick with this, or am I going to quit at the first sign of difficulty and just bounce around and then eventually become difficult to employ? So having a sense of purpose, and again, mathematics for human flourishing, if we could there's studies that show that if you ask students before they do their math work, think of a noble purpose you'd like to contribute to, and they think of that, and then they start doing their work, their ability to perform in math goes up, and their ability to perform in other subjects goes up. So just inviting people to reconnect with purpose, but don't expect that all of your purpose is going to be realized in one aspect of the human experience. So, when I talk about not being engaged at work and how the vast majority of workers are not engaged, there's probably some things we could do around job crafting that would help people become more engaged, and there's probably some things we can do about setting reasonable expectations, but knowing our purpose in life and how that might not be a one-to-one relationship with our purpose at work. Thank you.
All right, let me stop you there. Let's give it up again for Professor Matthew Lee. Thank you, my friend. This is really, really, really special. And thank you so much to all of you for being part of the Center for Brain Health's Frontier Lecture, and to everyone online. We really appreciate it. We're very grateful for your time. We hope you've taken a lot away from it. Next week, we have actually a whole lineup this fall of Frontier lectures, which is fantastic. Next week, October 18th, we have the chair of UTD's neuroscience department, Gregory Dusser, who's going to come, and he's going to talk about, something that's a little bit difficult, the higher prevalence of migraines in women. So I think that could be a great interest to many people on that. So the last thing I'll say is we're great. There we are. Oh, please, if you haven't done it already, take our Great Brain Gain Text Challenge, a simple way to get involved in the brain health journey on that. And this brings to a close our session today. Thank you so much. Another big hand for Matthew Lee.